The moment Delilah Reynolds stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Marysville, Kansas, in the sweltering summer of 1878, she knew she was making a colossal mistake, but she had nowhere else to go. Her older sister Margaret lived here with her husband, a modest shopkeeper who had reluctantly agreed to take Delilah in after what everyone back in St. Louis was calling the scandal. Delilah pulled her worn carpetbag close to her chest and scanned the busy Main Street, the late afternoon sun beating down mercilessly on her black mourning dress. She was not mourning a death exactly, but rather the death of who she thought she was, who she thought she would become. 3 months ago, she had been engaged to Thomas Whitfield, a banker's son with impeccable manners and an impressive inheritance. They had courted for nearly a year, and Delilah had allowed herself to believe that someone could actually love her, despite her plain features and quiet demeanor. Her mother had always said she was too bookish, too serious, not charming enough to attract a quality husband. But Thomas had seemed different. He had listened when she spoke about her love of literature, had brought her flowers every Sunday after church, had kissed her hand with what seemed like genuine affection. Then came the garden party at the Whitfield estate, where Delilah had accidentally overheard Thomas speaking with his cousin behind the rose trellises. The words still echoed in her mind, sharp and cutting as broken glass. "She is dreadfully dull, is she not?" Thomas had said, his voice carrying that dismissive tone she had never heard him use before. "But father insists I marry someone sensible, and Delilah is certainly that. No fire, no passion, nothing that would cause trouble. She will make an adequate wife, I suppose, even if the thought of spending every evening with her for the rest of my life fills me with unspeakable tedium." His cousin had laughed, a cruel sound that made Delilah's stomach turn. She had stood frozen behind those roses, her heart crumbling into dust. When she confronted Thomas that same evening, he had not even had the decency to deny it. Instead, he had grown defensive, angry even, telling her she should be grateful that someone of his standing would consider marrying her at all. He called off the engagement the next day, claiming she was too emotional, too sensitive, proving his point about her inadequacy. Delilah had spent weeks in her room, unable to eat, unable to sleep, replaying every moment of their courtship and wondering what fundamental flaw within her made her so inherently unlovable. Her mother had not helped, sighing dramatically and lamenting that Delilah had ruined her best chance at a respectable marriage. The whispers and pitying glances from their social circle became unbearable, and when Margaret's letter arrived offering a temporary refuge in Kansas, Delilah had accepted immediately. Now, standing in this dusty frontier town that smelled of horses and cattle and sun-baked earth, Delilah felt the weight of her conviction settle over her like a shroud. She was unlovable. Thomas had merely confirmed what she had always suspected deep down. She would live out her days as a spinster, dependent on the charity of her sister, and she would never again make the mistake of believing someone could truly want her. Delilah. A voice called out, and she turned to see Margaret hurrying toward her, her dress considerably simpler than what she would have worn back in St. Louis, her face flushed from the heat. Margaret embraced her quickly, then held her at arm's length, examining her with worried eyes. "You look so thin." "Was the journey terrible?" "It was fine," Delilah said, her voice hollow. She was tired of people looking at her with that expression, that mixture of pity and concern that made her feel like a wounded animal. Margaret's husband Samuel came to collect her bag, greeting her kindly but briefly, and they walked through town toward the modest house on the edge of Marysville. Margaret filled the silence with chatter about the town, about the neighbors, about how different life was here compared to St. Louis. Delilah barely heard any of it. She was already planning how to make herself useful, how to earn her keep without being too much of a burden, how to fade quietly into the background of her sister's life. What Delilah did not expect was how much work there was to do. Margaret and Samuel ran a general store, and Margaret was 6 months pregnant with their first child, which made the physical demands of the business increasingly difficult. Within days of Delilah's arrival, she found herself helping in the store, managing inventory, serving customers, and keeping the books. The work was exhausting but welcome. It kept her mind occupied, kept her from dwelling too much on her worthlessness. 2 weeks into her new life, a cowboy walked into the store. Delilah was behind the counter, reconciling the accounts in the leather-bound ledger, when she heard the door open and the distinctive sound of spurs jingling. She looked up out of habit, preparing her professional greeting, and found herself staring at one of the most striking men she had ever seen. He was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin, wearing dusty work clothes and a well-worn hat that he removed upon entering. His hair was dark and slightly too long, and his eyes were an unusual shade of green that seemed to catch the light streaming through the window. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I am looking for some tobacco and a new rope if you have it." Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks and immediately looked back down at her ledger. "The tobacco is on the shelf behind you and the rope is in the back. I will get it for you." She moved quickly, eager to complete the transaction and have him leave. Beautiful men made her uncomfortable now. They reminded her too much of Thomas, of how easily charm could mask cruelty. When she returned with the rope, the cowboy was examining a set of spurs on display, running his thumb over the intricate metalwork with obvious appreciation. He looked up when she approached and smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Thank you kindly. These are fine spurs. Your husband make them?" "I am not married," Delilah said quickly, more sharply than she intended. "And no, we purchased them from a craftsman in Abilene." She expected him to make some comment, some joke about her unmarried status as men often did, but instead, he simply nodded and brought his items to the counter. As she calculated his total, she was acutely aware of him watching her, though his gaze did not feel invasive or uncomfortable. It felt curious, almost gentle. "You are new in town," he said. It was not a question. "I am staying with my sister," Delilah replied, keeping her eyes on her work. "That will be $1.30. He counted out the coins, his hands rough and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. "Well, welcome to Marysville. It is a good town, mostly honest folks. I hope you will like it here." Delilah nodded curtly, not trusting herself to respond with anything more. She wrapped his purchases in brown paper and handed them over, eager for the interaction to end. But as he turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "The name is Ethan Ellis, madam. I work at the Carson Ranch, just west of town. If you or your sister ever need anything, you just let me know." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Delilah stood there for a moment, staring at the space he had occupied, feeling oddly unsettled. Then she shook her head and returned to her ledger. It did not matter how polite he seemed. She was not interested in any man's attention, not now, not ever again. But Ethan Ellis, as it turned out, was not a man who could be easily dismissed. The next day, he was back, this time purchasing ammunition and a new canteen. The day after that, he needed salt and coffee. On the fourth day, Margaret pulled Delilah aside with an amused expression. "That Ellis boy is sweet on you," she said, grinning. "He is finding any excuse to come into the store." Delilah felt panic rise in her chest. "Do not be ridiculous. He is just a customer." A customer who never needed supplies this frequently before you arrived, Margaret said, laughing. Delilah, he is a good man. His family has a small ranch nearby and he works hard. You could do worse. I am not looking for anything, Delilah said firmly, her hands trembling slightly. Please, Margaret, do not encourage this. I cannot. I will not. Her sister's expression softened and she reached out to squeeze Delilah's hand. I know Thomas hurt you terribly, but not every man is like him. Some are actually decent. Delilah pulled her hand away. I am perfectly content as I am. Please drop this. Margaret sighed but did not press further. However, Ethan continued to appear at the store with surprising regularity. Each time he was unfailingly polite, making small talk about the weather or the town, never pushing for more than Delilah was willing to give. She remained cool and professional, answering his questions with the minimum required courtesy, hoping he would eventually tire of her coldness and move on. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after their first meeting, Delilah was sweeping the front steps of the store when a group of young men rode past on horseback, rowdy and clearly drunk, despite the early hour. One of them, a ranch hand named Billy who had a reputation for causing trouble, called out to her. Hey there, pretty lady, why do you not smile? You would look a lot better if you smiled. His companions laughed, and Delilah felt her face burn with humiliation. She kept her head down and continued sweeping, trying to ignore them. What is the matter? You too good to talk to us, Billy called again, pulling his horse to a stop in front of the store. We are just being friendly. Leave her alone, Billy. The voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of warning. Delilah looked up to see Ethan Ellis stepping out from the feed store across the street, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. Billy laughed, but there was nervousness in it. We are just having some fun, Ellis. No harm meant. I am sure Miss Reynolds does not find it amusing, Ethan said, walking slowly toward them. Why do you not ride on and sleep off whatever you have been drinking? For a moment, tension hung thick in the air. Billy was young and stupid but not foolish enough to challenge Ethan Ellis, who had a reputation as someone you did not want to cross. With a final muttered curse, Billy spurred his horse forward, and the group rode off down the street, their laughter fading into the distance. Ethan turned to Delilah, his expression concerned. Are you all right, Miss Reynolds? Delilah gripped the broom handle tightly, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill over. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how even a minor confrontation could shake her so badly. I am fine. Thank you for your intervention, but it was not necessary. I can handle a few drunk cowboys. I am sure you can, Ethan said gently. But that does not mean you should have to. He tipped his hat to her and started to walk away, but Delilah found herself speaking before she could stop herself. Why do you keep coming here? Ethan turned back, his expression unreadable. I need supplies. You do not need supplies every single day, Mr. Ellis. I am not stupid. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Delilah saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not the calculating interest she had seen in Thomas's eyes, not the hungry look that some men gave her. It was something softer, something that looked almost like hope. No, you are definitely not stupid, he said finally. You are probably one of the smartest people I have met in this town. You are also sad, and I think someone hurt you very badly. I keep coming here because I like seeing you, even if you barely say 2 words to me. I keep coming here because I think maybe, if I am patient enough, you might eventually believe that not everyone is going to hurt you. Delilah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her throat tightened and she shook her head. You do not know anything about me. Then let me learn, Ethan said simply. I am not asking for anything, Miss Reynolds. I am just here. That is all. He walked away then, leaving Delilah standing on the steps, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to dismiss his words, to armor herself against them, but they had slipped through her defenses like water through cupped hands. That evening, she lay in bed in the small room Margaret had prepared for her, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation. She thought about Thomas, about his cruel words, about the certainty she had carried with her that she was fundamentally flawed. But she also thought about the way Ethan had looked at her, without pity, without judgment, just genuine interest and something that might have been admiration. No, she told herself firmly. She could not let herself hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to devastation. The next morning, when Ethan walked into the store, Delilah was ready with her walls firmly back in place. He purchased some flour and beans, made a comment about the fine weather, and left without pressing for more conversation. And the morning after that, the same. And the one after that. Days turned into weeks, and Delilah began to notice something remarkable. Ethan never pushed. He never made her feel obligated to entertain him. He simply existed in her orbit with a steadiness that was both bewildering and oddly comforting. He was always respectful, always kind, and more than that, he seemed to pay attention to the small things. When he noticed her struggling to move a heavy crate, he stepped in to help without making her feel incapable. When she mentioned in passing that she missed having access to books, he returned the next day with 2 novels borrowed from the local minister's small library. When Margaret commented that Delilah had a talent for numbers, Ethan told her with genuine sincerity that smart women were the backbone of civilization, no matter what some fools might think. Every single day, he proved through small actions that he saw her, truly saw her, as someone valuable and worthy of respect. And slowly, against her better judgment and despite every wall she had built, Delilah felt something shifting inside her chest. One particularly hot afternoon in August, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Marysville, the store was quiet. Margaret had gone home to rest, her pregnancy making the heat especially difficult to bear, and Delilah was alone, taking inventory in the back room. She heard the bell above the door chime and called out that she would be right there. When she emerged, she found Ethan standing near the counter, holding his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Miss Reynolds," he said, "I was wondering if you might do me the honor of joining me for supper tomorrow evening. There is a church social, and I thought you might enjoy getting out of the store for a bit." Delilah's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into her safe isolation. But something made her pause. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and saw nothing but sincerity in his face. He was not trying to manipulate her or charm her into something. He was simply asking, giving her the choice, willing to accept whatever answer she gave. "I do not know," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know if I am ready for that." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is all right. The offer stands whenever you are ready." "There is no pressure, Miss Reynolds. None at all." He placed a nickel on the counter, though he had not purchased anything, tipped his hat, and left. Delilah stared at the nickel for a long time, her emotions in turmoil. That evening she talked to Margaret about it. "He asked me to the church social," Delilah said, helping her sister prepare dinner. "I did not give him an answer." Margaret smiled knowingly. "He has been courting you for 2 months, Delilah, very patiently, I might add. What are you afraid of?" "I am afraid of being hurt again," Delilah admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I am afraid of believing someone could actually care for me, only to discover it was all pretense. I am afraid that he will eventually see what Thomas saw, that I am dull and uninteresting and not worth the effort." Margaret set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables and pulled Delilah into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetness, Thomas was a blind fool who could not recognize genuine quality when it was standing right in front of him. You are brilliant and thoughtful and kind. If he found you dull, it was because he was too shallow to appreciate depth. Delilah allowed herself to be held, tears streaming down her face. But what if that is just what sisters are supposed to say? What if the truth is that I am exactly what Thomas said I was? Then why does Ethan keep coming back? Margaret asked gently. Why has he spent 2 months being patient and kind, expecting nothing in return? Men like him do not waste their time, Delilah. If he did not genuinely like you, he would have moved on weeks ago. Delilah pulled back, wiping her eyes. I am terrified. I know, Margaret said softly, but being terrified means you care, and caring means you are still capable of hope, even if you are trying to convince yourself otherwise. That night, Delilah barely slept. She thought about every interaction she had had with Ethan, analyzing them for signs of deception or hidden cruelty. But no matter how hard she looked, she could not find any. He had been nothing but genuine, showing up day after day, not with grand gestures or flowery words, but with steady, reliable presence. The next morning, when Ethan came into the store, Delilah took a deep breath and said, before she could lose her nerve, "Yes." He looked at her, confused. "Yes. Yes, I will go to the church social with you, if the offer is still open." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise, warm and radiant and completely unguarded. "Of course it is still open. I will pick you up at 6 o'clock if that suits you," Delilah nodded, her heart hammering. "That suits me fine." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. Margaret helped her choose a dress, a soft blue cotton that was far simpler than what she would have worn to a social event in St. Louis, but it suited the setting and the warm evening. As 6 o'clock approached, Delilah found herself standing in front of the small mirror in her room, staring at her reflection and wondering what Ethan saw when he looked at her. She was not beautiful. Her features were too plain, her figure too slight. Her hair, a mousy brown, refused to hold curls the way fashionable women's hair did. She was exactly what she had always been, exactly what Thomas had found so lacking. But when Ethan arrived, driving a small wagon that had clearly been cleaned and polished for the occasion, and she stepped out onto the porch, the expression on his face made her breath catch. He looked at her as though she were something precious, something worth the careful journey into town, something that made his evening suddenly brighter. "You look lovely, Miss Reynolds," he said, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. The church social was held in a large barn on the outskirts of town, decorated with paper lanterns and filled with families and young couples. Long tables were laden with food, and a group of musicians played cheerful fiddle music in one corner. Delilah felt overwhelmed by the crowd, the noise, the dozens of curious eyes that turned to watch her arrive with Ethan Ellis. But Ethan stayed close, introducing her to people with pride in his voice, making sure she always had a drink in her hand and someone kind to talk to. He did not abandon her to socialize on his own, and he did not treat her like an obligation. Instead, he seemed genuinely pleased to have her there, checking in frequently to make sure she was comfortable. As the evening progressed, Delilah found herself relaxing, even enjoying the conversations. The people of Marysville were rougher around the edges than the society crowd she had known in St. Louis, but they were also more genuine, less concerned with pretense and social maneuvering. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Ethan turned to her with a slightly shy expression. "Would you dance with me, Miss Reynolds?" Delilah hesitated. She had always been an awkward dancer, self-conscious and stiff. But something in Ethan's eyes made her nod, and she placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor. He was a better dancer than she expected, guiding her smoothly through the steps, and Delilah found that when she stopped overthinking and simply followed his lead, it was almost effortless. They moved together in comfortable silence for several moments before Ethan spoke. "I am glad you came tonight," he said quietly. "I know it was not easy for you." "How do you know that?" Delilah asked, genuinely curious. "Because I pay attention," he said simply. "You carry yourself like someone who has learned to expect disappointment. Like you are always braced for the next blow. It makes me angry, to be honest, that someone taught you to feel that way." Delilah missed a step, and Ethan caught her easily, steadying her. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "I was engaged once. He told me I was boring, tedious. That spending time with me filled him with dread. And then he ended things, making sure everyone knew it was my fault, that I was not woman enough to hold his interest." Ethan's jaw tightened, and she saw genuine anger flash in his eyes. "Then he was a damned fool who did not deserve you." "Or he was simply being honest about my shortcomings," Delilah said, looking away. "No," Ethan said firmly, and the intensity in his voice made her look back at him. "No, Delilah. May I call you Delilah?" She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "You are not boring," he continued, his voice low and passionate. "You are thoughtful. You consider your words before you speak them, which makes them worth hearing. You are intelligent and capable and kind. You work hard, you care about your family, and you have more strength than you give yourself credit for. That man was too shallow to appreciate depth, and losing you was his loss, not yours." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Ethan said. "And I would like to know more if you will let me, but only if you want that too. I am not going to pressure you or rush you. I will wait as long as it takes for you to believe that you are worth waiting for." The music ended, and couples began to leave the floor, but Delilah and Ethan stood there, the world seeming to narrow down to just the two of them. She saw nothing but sincerity in his face, nothing but patience and genuine affection, and something inside her chest, something that had been locked and frozen since that terrible day in the garden, began to thaw. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like to know you better too." Ethan's smile was gentle and relieved. "Then that is what we will do. No expectations, no rush. Just two people learning about each other." "Does that sound all right?" Delilah nodded, and for the first time in months she felt something that might have been happiness. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm in Delilah's life. Ethan continued to visit the store daily, but now their conversations grew longer, more substantial. He told her about growing up on a small ranch, about losing his parents to illness when he was 18, about working hard to keep the family land going with his younger brother. He spoke about his dreams of expanding their herd, of building something lasting and good. Delilah, in turn, began to open up about her own life. She told him about her love of reading, about how she had always felt like a disappointment to her mother, about the terrible isolation she had felt in St. Louis society, where everyone seemed to speak a language she could not quite master. She told him, haltingly, about Thomas, about the humiliation and the crushing weight of believing herself to be fundamentally defective. Ethan listened to every word with focused attention, never interrupting, never dismissing her feelings. And when she finished, he simply said, "Thank you for trusting me with that. I know it was not easy." He began inviting her on walks after the store closed, showing her the countryside around Marysville. They would stroll along the creek that ran west of town, talking about everything and nothing, and Delilah found herself laughing more than she had in years. Ethan had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and he seemed to delight in making her smile. One evening in late September, as the weather began to cool and the leaves started to turn, They were walking back from the creek when they encountered a group of children playing near the schoolhouse. One little girl had climbed too high in a tree and was now frozen with fear, unable to get down. Delilah immediately moved to help, coaxing the child with gentle words while Ethan positioned himself below in case she fell. Together, they managed to get the girl safely down, and she ran off to her grateful mother. As they continued walking, Ethan said thoughtfully, "You are good with children." "Have you ever thought about teaching?" Delilah blinked, surprised. "I have not, actually. Do you think I could?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Ethan said simply. "The school is always looking for help, and Mrs. Patterson mentioned she is overwhelmed with the number of students this year. You might consider offering to assist her." It was such a simple suggestion, but it opened up a possibility Delilah had not considered. The next day, she approached Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, and offered her services. Within a week, she was spending her mornings helping with the younger children, teaching them their letters and numbers, and discovering that she had a genuine talent for it. The work gave her a sense of purpose she had not felt in a long time. The children did not care that she was not charming or socially graceful. They cared that she was patient, that she made learning enjoyable, that she treated them with respect. And as the weeks passed, Delilah began to see herself differently. Not through Thomas's cruel assessment or her mother's disappointed sighs, but through the eyes of children who lit up when she entered the room, through the gratitude of Mrs. Patterson who told her she was invaluable, and through the steady, unwavering regard of Ethan Ellis. By October, Delilah had to admit to herself that she was falling in love. It terrified her. Every time she felt her heart opening to Ethan, fear would grip her chest and she would pull back, testing him, waiting for him to reveal that this had all been some elaborate game. But he never did. He simply remained steady, patient, proving day after day through his actions that he meant every word he had ever said to her. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan asked if she would like to visit his ranch. "My brother Jesse has been asking to meet you," he said, a note of nervousness in his voice that Delilah found endearing. "But only if you are comfortable with that. I know it is a bigger step." Delilah agreed, and the following Sunday, Ethan drove her out to the Ellis ranch. It was a modest spread with a sturdy house, a barn and corrals where several horses grazed. Jesse Ellis was 20 years old, tall and lanky with the same green eyes as his brother, and he greeted Delilah with open friendliness. "So you are the woman who has my brother walking around with his head in the clouds," Jesse said, grinning. "It is about time someone caught his attention. He has been married to this ranch for too long." Ethan rolled his eyes but smiled, and Delilah felt warmth spread through her chest at the easy affection between the brothers. They gave her a tour of the property, and Delilah was struck by how much work the two men had put into maintaining it. Everything was tidy and well cared for, speaking to a deep pride in their home. Over dinner, which Ethan had prepared with surprising skill, Jesse told stories about their childhood, about the trouble they had gotten into and the lessons their parents had taught them. Delilah found herself laughing freely, enjoying the warmth and authenticity of their company. As the sun began to set and Ethan prepared to drive her back to town, Jesse pulled her aside. "He is a good man," Jesse said quietly. "The best I know, and I have not seen him this happy in years. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." On the ride back, as the wagon rattled along the dusty road under a sky painted pink and orange, Delilah felt something shift inside her. She looked at Ethan's profile, strong and steady, and realized that she trusted him. Somewhere along the way, through months of patient, consistent care, He had proven that not all men were like Thomas, that she was capable of being loved for exactly who she was. "Ethan," she said softly. He glanced at her, his expression warm. "Yes, thank you for everything. For being patient with me, for not giving up even when I was cold and distant, for proving that I was wrong about myself." Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop, right there in the middle of the road, and turned to face her fully. "You were never wrong about yourself, Delilah. You just had the misfortune of being judged by someone who was looking for all the wrong things. You are extraordinary, exactly as you are, and I feel privileged every single day that you let me be part of your life." Delilah felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of healing, of joy that she had thought was forever beyond her reach. "I think I am falling in love with you," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." Ethan reached out and gently wiped her tears away with his thumb. "I fell in love with you the first day I walked into that store and you looked up at me with those serious eyes and told me exactly where to find the rope. I have been yours ever since, and if you need more time to be sure, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need." But Delilah shook her head. "I do not need more time. I am sure. You have shown me every single day who you are, and I trust that. I love you, Ethan Ellis." The kiss they shared was soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, Delilah was smiling, truly smiling, for what felt like the first time in her entire life. The rest of the autumn passed in a golden haze of happiness. Ethan courted her properly, with the full approval and enthusiastic encouragement of Margaret and Samuel. He brought her flowers from the fields around his ranch, took her on picnics by the creek, and spent long evenings sitting on Margaret's porch, talking about their hopes and dreams for the future. In early November, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and Delilah helped care for both mother and child, marveling at the fierce love in her sister's eyes when she looked at her son. Watching Margaret and Samuel together, seeing the deep partnership they had built, gave Delilah a vision of what her own future might look like. 2 weeks later, on a cold November evening, Ethan asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the fireplace in Margaret's parlor, Delilah reading aloud from a novel while Ethan whittled a small wooden horse for his nephew. She finished the chapter and looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it made her breath catch. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because you think you should, not because you feel obligated, but because you want to build a life with me, because you love me as much as I love you." Delilah set the book aside, her heart full to bursting. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Ethan crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her dizzy and breathless. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at once, Margaret appeared in the doorway, the baby in her arms, and immediately started crying herself when she realized what had happened. They were married in December, in the small church in Marysville, with what felt like the entire town in attendance. Delilah wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her make, and Ethan wore his best suit, looking impossibly handsome and nervous as he waited at the altar. When Delilah walked down the aisle on Samuel's arm, Ethan's face transformed with such obvious love and joy that several women in the congregation openly wept. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but they felt weighty and significant, a promise not just to love each other but to keep choosing each other, day after day, through whatever challenges life brought. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with such enthusiasm that the congregation burst into applause and laughter. The reception was held in the same barn where they had attended the church social months earlier. And as Delilah danced with her new husband, surrounded by people who had come to genuinely care for her, She felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. Later that night, when Ethan carried her over the threshold of the ranch house that was now her home, Delilah felt no fear, no anxiety, only a deep sense of rightness. This was where she belonged. With this man who had seen her at her most guarded and afraid, and had responded not with frustration or manipulation, but with patient, steadfast love. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and afterward, lying in Ethan's arms in the darkness, Delilah said softly, "I never thought I could be this happy. I never thought anyone would love me like this." Ethan tightened his arms around her. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it again." And he kept that promise. The first year of marriage had its challenges, as any first year does. The ranch demanded long hours of hard work, especially in the spring when it was time for calving and branding. Delilah learned to manage the household, to cook meals for hungry ranch hands, to keep the books and help with the endless tasks that running a ranch required. It was exhausting, harder physical work than anything she had done in St. Louis, but it was also deeply satisfying. She continued teaching at the school 3 mornings a week, something Ethan insisted she keep doing because he knew how much it meant to her. "You have a gift," he told her firmly, "and it would be a waste not to share it." There were difficult moments, too. In February, they lost several head of cattle to a brutal winter storm, and the financial strain was significant. Delilah watched Ethan struggle with the weight of it, and she did everything she could to support him, stretching their budget, finding creative ways to economize, and never once complaining about the hardship. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Ethan came in from the barn looking defeated. Delilah set aside her mending and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and holding him tight. "We will get through this," she said firmly. "Together." Ethan rested his chin on the top of her head. "I am sorry I cannot give you the easier life you might have had." Delilah pulled back and looked up at him fiercely. "I do not want an easier life if it means not having you. This, right here, this is everything I need." The gratitude and love in his eyes made her heart ache in the best possible way. By spring, the ranch had recovered, and they even managed to purchase additional land, expanding their grazing territory. Jesse had started courting a young woman from town, and Ethan teased him mercilessly about it, clearly delighted to see his brother happy. In May, Delilah realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex swirl of emotions. Joy, certainly, but also fear. She had heard the stories about childbirth, about the risks, and she worried about being a good mother. But when she told Ethan, his reaction was pure, unfiltered happiness. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a child, and then immediately became ridiculously overprotective, insisting she sit down, rest, eat more. "Ethan," she said, laughing, "I am pregnant, not made of glass." But his devotion during those months was touching. He did everything he could to make things easier for her, taking over tasks she normally handled, bringing her flowers for no reason, talking to her growing belly when he thought she was asleep. Margaret was thrilled at the news, and the two sisters spent long afternoons together, Margaret sharing advice and stories about motherhood while their children played nearby. The bond between the sisters, which had always been strong, deepened even further. In late January of 1880, on a night when a fierce wind rattled the windows and snow fell thick and fast, Delilah went into labor. Ethan rode through the storm to fetch the midwife, and Margaret came to stay with her, holding her hand through the long, difficult hours. When their son was finally born in the early hours of the morning, small and red and screaming with impressive fury, Delilah felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Ethan cried openly when he held his son for the first time, looking at the tiny, perfect face with absolute awe. They named him William, after Ethan's father, and he became the center of their world. Delilah discovered that motherhood came more naturally to her than she had feared. She was patient and attentive, and watching Ethan with their son filled her with overwhelming love. He was a devoted father, gentle and playful, teaching William about horses and cattle as soon as the boy could walk. Life settled into a new rhythm. The ranch continued to grow and prosper under Ethan's careful management and Delilah's sharp financial mind. Jesse married his sweetheart Emily and built a house on the eastern section of their land, and the extended family grew close, sharing meals and celebrations and helping each other through difficult times. Delilah continued teaching, bringing William with her to the schoolhouse where he played quietly while she worked with the students. The townspeople had fully embraced her as one of their own, and she served on the church committee and helped organize social events. 3 years after William's birth, their daughter Clara was born, a tiny girl with dark curls and her father's green eyes. And 2 years after that, their second son Thomas arrived, completing their family. The choice of that name had not been easy. When Delilah suggested it, Ethan had looked at her carefully. "Are you sure? After everything?" Delilah had thought about it and nodded. "He does not deserve to have that name tied to bitterness. I want to reclaim it, fill it with good memories instead of painful ones. This Thomas will be loved and cherished, and maybe that will finally close that chapter of my life completely." Ethan had kissed her forehead gently. "You are wiser than I will ever be." The years passed in a blur of activity and love. William grew tall and serious like his mother, with a love of books and a sharp mind. Clara was spirited and adventurous, always getting into scrapes and keeping her parents on their toes. Young Thomas was affectionate and easygoing, the peacemaker among his siblings. Ethan kept his promise, proving his love to Delilah every single day, not through grand gestures, but through the small, steady acts of devotion. He brought her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. He listened when she talked about her day, really listened, asking questions and caring about the details. He supported her dreams, encouraged her to keep teaching even when the demands of the ranch and family grew. He told her she was beautiful, especially on the days when she felt worn down and tired. He made her laugh, even during the difficult times, and Delilah flourished in the warmth of that constant, reliable love. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Marysville, convinced of her own worthlessness, was gone. In her place was someone confident and capable, someone who knew her own value, someone who had learned that true love was not about being perfect or charming or anything other than simply being yourself. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took her back to the creek where they had walked so many times during their courtship. The children were with Margaret for the day, giving them rare time alone together. They sat on a blanket by the water, watching the sunlight dance across the surface, and Ethan pulled out a small carved wooden box. "What is this?" Delilah asked, curious. "Open it," he said, smiling. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of the two of them on their wedding day on one side, and on the other, a picture of their 3 children. "I wanted you to have something that reminded you of how far you have come," Ethan said softly. "You walked into that store 10 years ago and you barely believed you deserved to take up space in the world. Now look at you. You are an amazing mother, a gifted teacher, the heart of our family, and the love of my life. I am so proud of who you are, Delilah." Tears streamed down Delilah's face as she clutched the locket. "I would not be any of those things without you. You taught me that I was worth loving. You proved it day after day until I finally believed it. Ethan pulled her close, kissing her temple. "We taught each other. You showed me what it means to truly love someone, to be patient and gentle even when it is hard. You made me a better man." They sat there by the creek for hours, talking about their life, their children, their dreams for the future. They talked about eventually expanding the ranch further, about William possibly going to university if he wanted, about the book Delilah was thinking about writing to help other teachers with their students. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan said thoughtfully, "Do you ever think about him, Thomas?" Delilah considered the question honestly. "Sometimes, but not with pain anymore. Sometimes I even feel grateful in a strange way. If he had not been cruel, I never would have come here. I never would have met you. Everything that has happened, all the happiness we have built, it came from that terrible moment. It does not excuse what he did, but it makes it feel less like a tragedy and more like a redirection." "You are much more forgiving than I am," Ethan said, his jaw tightening slightly. "If I ever meet him, I will have to work very hard not to punch him in the face." Delilah laughed, a free, joyful sound. "My fierce protector, I love you so much, Ethan Ellis. And I love you, Delilah Ellis. Every day, more than the day before." As they drove back to the ranch in the gathering twilight, Delilah felt a profound sense of peace. Her life had not turned out anything like she had planned when she was a young woman in St. Louis. It was harder, more demanding, full of challenges she could never have anticipated. But it was also infinitely richer, more meaningful, more joyful. She had learned that love was not about perfect compatibility or never struggling. It was about choosing each other again and again through the good days and the difficult ones. It was about seeing someone fully, flaws and strengths alike, and deciding they were worth it. It was about building something together, slowly and steadily, one day at a time. When they arrived home, the children came running out, having been returned by Margaret and Samuel. William immediately launched into a story about something he had seen at his aunt's house, while Clara tugged on Delilah's skirt, demanding attention, and little Thomas wrapped himself around Ethan's leg. The house was chaos and noise and overwhelming need, and it was perfect. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Delilah and Ethan sat on the porch in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Kansas sky. Ethan reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Do you remember what you said to me that day in the store when you asked why I kept coming back?" he asked. Delilah smiled. "I do. I was so certain you had some ulterior motive." "I did," Ethan said, squeezing her hand. "My motive was getting to know the most interesting woman I had ever met. My motive was proving to you that you deserve to be loved. My motive was spending the rest of my life with you if you would have me." "Best ulterior motive anyone ever had," Delilah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat there until the night grew cold, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Finally, Ethan stood and pulled her to her feet, leading her inside to the warmth of their home, to the life they had built together from determination and patience and unwavering love. The years continued to unfold, bringing new joys and new challenges. William did indeed go to university, studying law, and eventually returned to Kansas to practice, making his parents incredibly proud. Clara married a young rancher and stayed close to home, filling the house with grandchildren and laughter. Thomas followed in his father's footsteps, taking over more and more of the ranch operations as Ethan grew older. Ethan and Delilah grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like good wine. They took walks by the creek even when their steps were slower, sat on the porch even when it required more blankets against the chill, and held hands across the dinner table even after 50 years of marriage. Delilah often thought about that frightened, heartbroken woman who had arrived in Marysville so long ago, convinced she was fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what the future held. Tell her that the pain she was experiencing was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something beautiful. But she also knew that woman could not have believed it, not then. She had needed to live through it, to experience Ethan's daily proof of her worth, to slowly learn to see herself through loving eyes. Some lessons could not be taught, only lived. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, and Delilah mourned her sister deeply. But she was grateful for all the years they had shared, for Margaret's unwavering support and love. Samuel followed his wife 2 years later, and the funeral was attended by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a testament to the legacy they had built. On Delilah and Ethan's 50th wedding anniversary, their family threw them a grand celebration at the ranch. Generations gathered, from their 3 children to their 9 grandchildren to their first great-grandchild, born just a month earlier. The house and yard were filled with food and music and laughter. And as Delilah looked around at all these people who had come from the love she and Ethan shared, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Late in the evening, when the party had quieted and most of the guests had left, Ethan found her standing alone by the barn, looking up at the stars. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head just as he had done 1,000 times before. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Delilah said, leaning back against him. "How different my life could have been. How close I came to missing all of this because I believed a lie about myself." "But you did not miss it," Ethan said firmly. "You were brave enough to give me a chance, brave enough to let yourself hope again. That took tremendous courage, Delilah." She turned in his arms to face him, looking up at the man who had been her constant companion for 50 years. His hair was white now, his face lined with age, but his eyes still held that same warmth, that same steady love that had captured her heart so long ago. "You saved me," she said simply. Ethan shook his head gently. "No, my love, we saved each other. You taught me what it meant to truly care for someone, to be patient and kind and steadfast. You made me better. We built this life together, and every good thing in it came from both of us." He was right, Delilah realized. It had never been about him rescuing her or fixing her. It had been about 2 people choosing to build something together, supporting each other, growing together, proving through their actions day after day that they were committed to the partnership they had created. "Dance with me," Ethan said suddenly, even though there was no music playing. Delilah laughed. "We are too old for dancing." "We are never too old for dancing," he insisted, and he began to hum a waltz, the same one they had danced to at that church social a lifetime ago. So they danced there in the moonlight, moving slowly and carefully, holding each other close. Their steps were not as sure as they once were, and their bodies were not as strong, but their love was as deep and true as it had ever been. When the song ended, Delilah looked up at her husband and said, "If I could do it all over again, I would not change a single thing. Not the heartbreak, not the pain, not the fear, because it all led me here to you, to this life. I would walk through all of it again for this." Ethan kissed her softly, tenderly, with all the love of 50 years in that one gesture. "As would I, my darling, as would I." They walked back to the house hand in hand, past children and grandchildren playing on the porch, past the life they had built through determination and patience and unwavering commitment. And as they settled into bed that night, Delilah felt complete peace. She had learned the most important lesson of her life, that she had always been worthy of love. She had just needed to find someone patient enough to prove it to her, and brave enough to wait while she learned to believe it. And she had found that in Ethan Ellis, a cowboy who had walked into a general store and had seen immediately what others had missed. He had seen strength where she saw weakness, value where she saw worthlessness, and possibility where she saw only limitation. He had proven, day after day after day, that love was not about grand gestures or flowery words, but about consistent, reliable presence. About showing up, paying attention, caring about the small things, and never giving up even when it was difficult. Ethan passed away quietly 3 years later in his sleep, at the age of 78. Delilah held his hand as he drew his last breath, and though her heart broke at the loss, she was grateful that he went peacefully, without pain or fear. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, and speaker after speaker stood to talk about his kindness, his integrity, his unwavering devotion to his family. But Delilah knew the truth that lived deeper than any word spoken at a funeral. Ethan Ellis had been a man who understood that love was a verb, not a feeling, that it required action and effort in choosing the same person every single day. He had proven that to her from the moment they met until his final breath, and the gift of that love had transformed not just her life but generations that came after. Delilah lived another 5 years after Ethan's death, surrounded by family who loved her fiercely. She spent her final years teaching young Thomas how to manage the ranch books, reading stories to her great-grandchildren, and sitting on the porch where she and Ethan had spent countless evenings together. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, along with the locket he had given her on their 10th anniversary, and she spoke of him often, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had not known him well. On a warm spring evening in 1938, Delilah Ellis passed away peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 81. Her last coherent words spoken to Clara, who sat by her bedside, were, "Tell your father I am coming home." They buried her next to Ethan, under the oak tree on the hill overlooking the ranch. At her funeral, William spoke about his mother's strength, Clara about her wisdom, and Thomas about her unconditional love. But it was William's daughter, also named Delilah, who perhaps captured it best. "My grandmother taught me that our worth is not determined by how others see us, but by how we choose to see ourselves," she said, her voice clear and strong. "She taught me that love is patient and kind and never gives up. She taught me that healing is possible, that broken hearts can mend, and that sometimes the darkest moments of our lives lead us to our brightest futures. She lived those lessons every single day, and because of her, all of us here know how to love better, live better, and be better. That is her legacy, and it will live on in us and in our children and in every generation that comes after." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, and the story of Ethan and Delilah Ellis became part of family legend. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the cowboy who patiently courted the heartbroken woman from St. Louis, proving to her day after day that she was worthy of love. They heard about walks by the creek, about dancing in the moonlight, about a marriage built on mutual respect and unwavering devotion. And in a world that often moved too fast, that prioritized convenience over commitment and passion over patience, the story of Ethan and Delilah stood as a reminder of what love could be when two people chose each other fully and completely, when they built something together with care and intention, when they refused to give up even when it was hard. Because in the end, that was what had made their love story so remarkable. Not that it was perfect, but that it was real. Not that they never struggled, but that they struggled together. Not that they had some fairy tale romance, but that they had chosen each other every single day, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow, through health and sickness, until death finally parted them. And even then, their love endured, living on in the hearts of those they had touched, in the values they had instilled, in the example they had set. It lived on in the ranch that still bore their name, in the town of Marysville where they had built their life, and in the countless small moments of kindness and patience that their descendants practiced, because they had learned from the best. Delilah Reynolds had arrived in Kansas convinced she was unlovable, broken beyond repair by one man's cruelty. But Ethan Ellis had proven her wrong, not with words but with actions, showing her daily through patient devotion that she was precious, valuable, and deeply worthy of love. And in learning to accept that love, Delilah had discovered who she truly was, not the dull, tedious woman Thomas had described, but someone strong and capable and full of quiet grace. Their story was not about rescue or salvation. It was about two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had built something beautiful together through hard work and commitment, and who had loved each other so well that their love rippled out to touch generations. It was about the transformative power of patient, consistent devotion, and the profound truth that sometimes the greatest love stories are not the passionate whirlwinds but the steady, enduring flames that burn bright and true for a lifetime. And so the story ended, as all stories must, but the love at its heart never truly died. It lived on, passed down like a precious heirloom, a testament to what was possible when two people chose to see the best in each other, to believe in each other's worth, and to prove their love not just with words but with the countless small actions that made up a life together. That was the legacy of Ethan and Delilah Ellis, and it was a legacy that would endure as long as there were hearts willing to learn what real love looked like.